My hometown is still missing. Do you know what happens when you search online for Fullerton City now? This post comes up. I'm not quite sure how to describe that feeling. We are a community of hundreds, if not thousands of people, each with countless stories and worries of our own. You are only hearing one of them now. I cannot understand how our digital footprint could disappear overnight, but here we are, day 2 in a missing city. I didn't get much sleep last night. Mark spent most of it glued to our bedroom window. He woke me and called me over now and again. Sometimes he saw flashes of light in the distance. Sometimes he saw movement in the trees. Mostly we saw fog. Thick blankets of it descended on our house like a comforter. It also never stopped raining. Big gusts of wind thumped the house hard enough to make us jump. But the most uncomfortable parts of the previous night were the periods of complete and total silence. Something about that quiet can make you crazy. In any given suburb, there are a million background noises at once, even in a storm, even at night. Birds should be chirping. Insects should be buzzing. Car engines or motorcycles or air conditioners should all be gently humming in unison. But we didn't hear any of it, not a single sound but our own. I couldn't stop thinking about the neighborhood dogs. Shouldn't they be barking? There was one in particular, a yappy little thing named Caesar, which never passed up a good opportunity to wake you up in favor of a scrambling squirrel or rabbit. Did our neighbors have time to get them inside? Did something else happen to them? What the duck happened to Caesar? Mark woke me up for the final time around 5. I tried and failed to shrug him off. I heard something in the street, he whispered. Let's go. I asked him what he heard. Clicking. He got up and walked towards the living room without another word. I didn't want to go. I was freaked out enough. I didn't and still don't need to add another ducked up layer to this situation. Blissful ignorance is sometimes the best approach. But I got a gut feeling that this wasn't something that should be missed, and I didn't want Mark to be there alone for it, so I followed him. The hallway that leads to the living room passes by my parents' bedroom. We could hear my mother snoring softly on the other side. A baseball bat was propped up by her nightstand. Her cell phone was at the ready right beside it. We tiptoed past the creaking wood floor and arrived at the entrance to the kitchen. The clicking became clearer by that point. Mark pointed over to an alcove by the couch. I followed him to the corner. Then he stopped dead in his tracks. My father was sleeping with the gun in his hand. There was a window behind him that looked out into our entire living room. Staring through the other side was a giant black eyeball. We froze. The eye darted back and forth across the room. We were in plain sight, just standing there in the kitchen like a couple of jackbutts, but for some reason, the eye didn't seem to notice us. It passed by a couple times to focus on the toaster or something else. My father must have subconsciously read the tension in the air. He stirred and moved to roll over. When he did, thankfully, we locked eyes. I put one finger to my lips. A sober understanding dawned on his face. He took the safety off his gun. The eye responded to the movement of the gun, and in one swift jolt, disappeared from behind the window, leaving a wake of leaves and scattered footsteps behind it. The air left my lungs. Something big ascended the wood steps to our porch. My dad turned to aim the gun. Rat-tap-tap. This time we didn't need anyone to tell us. We all stayed quiet. We sat in still silence for the better part of the early morning. My mother awoke some hours later and got prepared to make breakfast, and only then did it feel safe enough to move around the house. Nobody told her what happened. I didn't think we needed to. My father certainly wasn't going to. I got the feeling from the look on his face that he would prefer not to talk at all for as long as he could. Mark returned to his spot by the window. Dad disappeared downstairs to get another box of ammo for his gun. I helped Mom cook over the fire and we all went about our tasks in complete and total silence. Nobody tried to fake conversation anymore. There wasn't any point in arguing about what was out there. We had enough food. We had enough water. Nobody was going anywhere. A knock came at the door just after noon. Each of us instantly stopped what we were doing. A sigh of relief echoed through the room when the familiar voice of our neighbor Mr. Hello followed. Richardson's. You in there? The door pounded harder. No time to explain, please, he shouted. Can you let us in? My father walked in and stood awkwardly between my mother and the door. I could tell that he would prefer to ignore it, but she would never let him live it down, the true married man's dilemma. Please, folks, if you're in there, open up. We don't have a lot of time. Mark shook his head. Please, he begged. Jean is hurt. My mom bit her nails. Dad gave in and reluctantly looked through the peephole. Satisfied with his view of the other side, he slid the pistol into his back pocket, unlatched the lock, and opened the door. Thank you. Mr. Hello is a big, burly guy. He took my father into his arms and slapped his back so hard the sound echoed down the hall. He moved over to chase my mother down for a kiss on the cheek as his wife and daughter trailed meekly behind. Thank you, he bellowed. Thank you, thank you. We didn't know if we'd see anybody else. My dad nodded awkwardly. My mom stepped up and hugged Mrs. Hello tight. A quiet, pitiful moan escaped her lips as she did. The two of them were usually thick as thieves. My neighbor was a nice lady, the type that usually never shuts up, but now she couldn't get a word out. A thin line of blood trickled behind her foot. It didn't take long to notice the source. Her slacks were cut from the ankle to the knee. My dad slammed the door. Come on, Jeannie, my mother cooed. Let's get you cleaned up. The two of them walked hand in hand to the kitchen. Mr. Hello sat down on our couch and wiped the sweat from his forehead and t-shirt. His daughter, Alice, perched herself neatly on the arm beside him. As I said, he said while catching his breath. Lucky we found somebody. My father nodded again. Did you see it? Mark asked. Whatever's out there, I mean. Mr. Hello stared back at him. He took a second before he spoke, like he wanted to pick his words, which didn't quite fit for a guy like him. One of them got in the house, he said definitively. An open window, downstairs, we trapped it in the basement. My father held up his hand. Didn't feel safe staying there, though. My father interrupted. Enough, he whispered. Take a break, Mike, let's talk. Mr. Hello nodded in bewilderment. He got up and shuffled after my father towards the dining room, leaving Mark and me, uncomfortably, with Alice. Alice Hello is around my age. She's short, with dark hair and dark eyes. She has this awkwardly adorable round head that she covers up with a bow, or pin, or some other new accessory every other day. I've had a crush on her since grade school. I know that's probably not relevant, but I just want to point out what may later become obvious. Mark elbowed me in the ribs. I ignored it. So did you see anything? I asked. Like, did you see anybody out there? She paused and then shook her head. Well, what does it look like outside? Mark asked. Normal, she answered. Quiet. And you didn't see anything? I asked again. When it started, I mean. She looked at me and shook her head, paused, then relented. We were all inside sleeping like you probably were. It was late, she started. Or early. I don't know. My dad was upstairs. I was upstairs. My mom doesn't sleep much, so she was doing some laundry in the basement. She hesitated. I don't know what woke me up first, her screaming, or the power going out. They both seemed to happen at the same time. My dad started shouting her name. You know, Jeannie. Jeannie, and my mom was just wailing from the basement. We both got to the kitchen and we could see her running up the steps. She was screaming at my dad. You know, close the door. Close the door. But my dad couldn't stop looking at whatever was behind her. He just froze. Right, Mark whispered. Can't blame him. So I reach out and slam the door, just as my mom makes it through, and something wedges itself in the doorway. Holy poop, I murmured. What was it? I don't know. Something thick and sharp. Like a claw, I guess. It was wet, too. It left a stain. Anyway, I couldn't get the door shut because of it. I was panicking. I kicked my dad in the shin and he threw his body weight against the frame. The lock finally clicked and we heard whatever it was fall down the stairs on the other side. She paused. It didn't come up again. My father re-emerged from the dining room some moments after our awkward silence. Mr. Hallow trailed sheepishly behind. Who's ready to eat? We ate our fire-cooked meal in relative silence. All four parents made it abundantly clear through menacing stares that the topic of the poop show outside would not be discussed with children present. Mark again asked if he could go for a walk. Nobody dignified him with a response. After our dishes were done and disposed of, we retreated into various alcoves of our suddenly cramped three-bedroom. Mark and I went back to our room. Alice set up shop in the office with her mom. My mother retired to bed early and both dads stood, sat, guard in the living room. The house grew quiet again. The wind and rain finally seemed to slow down. My Stephen King novella kept me company. I couldn't help but empathize with the main character. Somewhere in between Tales of Rats in Armor, Bat Rats, and albino rats who never saw the sun, sleep came easily and comfortably under my familiar warm sheets. I woke up to a rude shaking. Alice was standing over me. She didn't say anything. I guess she didn't have to. Mark and I rubbed the last remaining ounce of sleep out of our eyes and followed her wordlessly into the office. 2 cots were set up in the room. One looked disheveled, the other was still made. Alice pointed to the open window. Her mother was gone.